Okay, 16 January. This and that. Again, this and that information on autonomouscollective.net. Hope you enjoyed last night's bit of stuff that we presented on the shape of things to come. Speaking of which, but today we're going to do, it's going to be a little shorter, we'll see. A paradoxical form of value, which is Appendix 3 of Michael Heinrich's How to Read Capital and of 2021. It is a curious book, and I think it was brought out to, in some ways, counter the publication of the Princeton 2024 translation done by the two Pauls. Um, and But I think it's important to look at both. That is, look at the new translation, but also appreciate the older translation, because the same issues are still there, regardless of the translation. The new translation, hasn't quite pushed us in a decision, let's say, on Marx, and I think that's all for the good. So today we're going to discuss value form, value substance, and value amount. And then three ways of looking at value, and they're in every moment. They apply to each and every commodity. Every commodity has them, and there are different degrees, and this is there, and it now the Appendix 3 is not a definitive description of the problem, because in fact you have to really look at a lot more Heinrich to sort of get through this. His commentary is actually quite good and worth looking at, if only because um, in German, in his German, that is Heinrich's German, and translated into English, we even see that kind of dissonance as well. And as tedious as that may seem, um, Appendix 3, among various other documents, helps try to explain this issue of what can be described. Hegel describes it as sublation, and you know that I've had this little thing about indexicality and sublation and a bunch of other technical things. But I would assert it's those technical things that allow us to take actual empirical stuff. For example, can you define an equilibrium in space? Spatially speaking, and I think you can actually, but it requires you to map a whole bunch of different things, and it sort of integrates some other work that I've done before on the idea that let's say you're looking at electromagnetic spectrum and non-electromagnetic spectrum distributed by wires. So there's a whole spectrum in that sense is kind of a multi-layered cake, as it were, for a particular region. You could actually begin to define market areas according to a certain types of value elements, and also begin to define um, when something like a sublation might actually exist. Now, in a very deeply capitalist way, you can use it actually to leverage markets. But in a larger sense, like in real estate or something else, you can look at how um, fictitious capital and fictitious capital value can be sort of seen in a more palpable kind of way. Not that if that's good or bad, well, who knows? But what my interest has been in contributing policy tools, and I think that you can actually develop a policy tool that's not so bogged down in these translation issues. So a value form approach, published in 2003 by Milios, is an interesting article to consider. And of course, I put the thing that indicates that one of the appendices that Heinrich talks about elsewhere, and we'll talk about in a moment on machine machines, the machines, which is still worth talking about. But until we get to that, we'll look at Appendix 3 by Heinrich. Now, I asked Gemini to wax philosophic on value form and sublation, or value form more specifically, and did this is worth sort of thinking about as we move forward, and not because it's perfectly accurate. It's just there's enough stuff in the Gemini large language model to sort of actually get working on this, particularly from a Marxian point of view. The concept of the value form in Marx's Capital has strong connections to Hegelian dialectics, particularly the notion of sublation or Aufhebung. Here's how. Sublation in Hegel. Sublation is a key concept in Hegel's philosophy. It describes a process where something is simultaneously negated, preserved, and overcome. It's not simply a destruction, but a transformation, where the old is incorporated into the new in a more advanced form. You can actually raise, and let me break there for a second and say, this is one way in which, and, now I've got to read more crap, is to, from a deconstruction point of view, this is a kind of way in which we can begin to talk about this. But then again, I haven't read it. Yes, I've read Derrida, but I haven't read enough Derrida, and particularly since he's dead, it's even more difficult to get a kind of pure opinion on whether how much Hegelian sublation relates to deconstruction. But anyway, that's another story. Value form as sublation, Marx's analysis of the value form demonstrates this process. Negation, the use value of a commodity is negated in the exchange process. Now, remember, this is what we've been talking about, that reliance on the exchange process is a way in which we can talk about value of the commodity and value formation and the commodity form of money and all that, those sorts of things, that the exchange process is connected to this negation process. Because if you negate something, as pointed out prior, it is simultaneously negated, preserved, and overcome. So you still have something there. So negation, that's the use value of commodities negated in the exchange process. The unique qualities of the object, its use, becomes secondary to its exchange value, doesn't eradicate it in that sense. Preservation, the use value is not entirely eliminated, right? That's the implication here. The commodity still retains its physical form and can be used. And this is a design issue in the larger picture, and I think that's also equally interesting. And if you're going on to deconstruction, this would be the problem of the trace. Overcoming. The commodity transcends its immediate use value and acquires a social and abstract form, which is the point, the yammering point of Heinrich about the question of concrete and abstract form. Exchange value. It becomes a representation of abstract human labor, which is exactly the point that we've been trying to fiddle with. It's not concrete human labor, but rather abstract human labor, and it appears in a variety of forms. Dialectical movement. The development of the value form is a dialectical process. It begins with a simple commodity with its use value as the primary characteristic. Through exchange, it develops into a more complex form where exchange value becomes dominant. This process involves a series of negations and transformations leading to the emergence of money as the universal equivalent. So essentially the path from chapters 1 through 4, or 1 through 3, is accomplished. So it's not that hard. And, fortunately or unfortunately, AI has simplified it, which is what it's good for, at least in my little brain. And so it's easy to explain it that way. And in fact, I don't find that problematic. In fact, it's worth doing that and then building, speaking of large language models, how, and this is where AI can actually do something, is looking at the context for the use of these things, at least in the English language, because sublation is from German, and so there's all these other possibilities and problems. In essence, the value form can be seen as a sublation of the commodity's use value. And now, whether that's perfectly true, it preserves the physical existence of the commodity while negating its immediate use. It's still in the box, in other words. and transforming it into an abstract representation of social labor. So that's kind of the current position of large language models on this stuff. And I think that's actually not so bad. I mean, it does need a little bit more work, and as all AI tends to oversimplify these matters. But once it sort of the AI does its little language branching business and hits on marks, it then automatically cranks up other problems. But I think the Hegelian literature is so clear now that it actually, the semantics of it is actually fairly it's cohering, let's put it that way. So anyway, Michael Heinrich, How to Read Capital 2021, Appendix 3, and it's not too very long a thing. The first chapter of the first edition of Capital is discussed, noting differences in the presentation of the value form by Marx. This chapter was also essential to the Neue Marx-Lektur, that is the new reading of Marx in the 1970s. We've talked about that before. It is that new reading of Marx that got us to Althusser and all that other stuff as a kind of response. People were trying to make up their damn minds in the post-World War II context, and which got a little bit more tangled up when communism from actually existing socialism got destroyed and turned into wacko oligarchy or techno-feudalism or whatever you want to call it at the present moment. So here, in Appendix 3, a paradoxical form of value. Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859 has a very brief presentation of the value form, and is not yet separate from the examination of the exchange process. The first detailed treatment of the value form is found in Chapter 1 of the first edition of Capital, published in 1867. In that edition, it exists in two versions, in Chapter 1 and, following the advice of Engels and Kugelmann, in a simplified version in the appendix. In the preface to the first edition, Marx said about the presentation of the value form in Chapter 1, it's difficult to understand because the dialectic is much sharper than in the first presentation, meaning that of the contribution of 1859. He recommended that the reader not used to dialectical thinking skip the corresponding passages in Chapter 1 and instead read the appendix. And the citation here is important only because it exists not as the MECW, but the MEGA, which is a later and more comprehensive collection of Marx and Engels archives. Marx did not explain in the preface what he meant by dialectic, but we may assume that in such a general context, the term refers to conceptual scientific reasoning. That the dialectic is much sharper means, therefore, that the scientific reasoning is much more exact and precise than in the contribution. The second edition, published in 1872 to 73, contains only one version of the value form analysis and is strongly oriented towards the simplified account in the first edition's appendix. Marx included the first edition's preface in the second edition, but he deleted both the reference to the now absent appendix and the sentence quoted above about the dialectic being, quote unquote, much sharper. He evidently assumed that he had achieved greater intelligibility despite the loss of the sharpness in the argument. Now, whether that's true or not is another question. As I argued above in Appendix 1, none of the three available versions of the value form analysis can be unambiguously characterized as, quote unquote, the best. Both in Marx's Appendix of Capital's first edition and in the second edition, there are improvements compared to the earlier version, but both later versions also lose some things along the way. In fact, that may be the whole business that we've been playing around with the 2024 version. One of the differences between the first version of the value form analysis and all later ones is the structure of the concluding part. Later versions end with the money form, but the first version of the value form analysis has the quote-unquote general form of value, followed by a paradoxical form of value called form 4. The money form does not yet show up at all. Here we reproduce, interspersed with comments, the presentation of the form 4, as well as Marx's concluding remarks, which are also absent from the later versions. It is a continuous piece of text, and all emphases are by Marx. The text is found in Das Kapital, first edition, 1867, with the Miga thing, and then there's the translation source, the Drogstedt, 1976. The illusion, that is the corrected translation, semblance or shine, is as if the equivalent form of a commodity resulted from its own corporeal nature instead of being a mere reflex of the relationship of other commodities. This illusion or semblance strengthens itself with the continuing development of the singular equivalent to the universal, because the contrary vectors of the value form no longer develop equally for the commodities which are related to one another, because the universal equivalent form separates a commodity off as something totally secluded from all other commodities. And finally, because this, the commodities form, is actually no longer the product of the relationship of any singular commodity. So there is this thing that occurs, this transformation that occurs. This synopsis clarifies what causes the semblance of the equivalent form. And in the actual commentary book here, he spends a little time on this, so we're going to come back to this, unfortunately. In the second edition of Capital, Marx makes reference to the mysteriousness of the equivalent form in his analysis of the simple form of value, page 149. It also explains why the semblance strengthens itself when we consider the general equivalent and not just a single equivalent. Capital's second and later editions, like the widespread fourth edition, MEW 23, and its translations, no longer explicitly mention the strengthening of the semblance. The later editions do, nevertheless, discuss how the general equivalent form no longer reveals that it's an antagonistic form, having the form of general exchangeability, because all other commodities do not have this form. In the later versions, there is no more than a brief mention of this, quote-unquote, false semblance becoming, quote-unquote, firmly established, and that reference appears in the presentation of the exchange process. From our present standpoint, the universal equivalent has not yet by any means ossified, however. What was the way in which linen was metamorphosed into the universal equivalent? Actually, by the fact that it displayed its value first in one single commodity, form 1, then in all other commodities in order in a relative way, form 2, and thereby all other commodities reflexively display their values in it in a relative way, form 3. The simple relative value expression was the seed out of which the universal equivalent form of linen developed. It changes its role within this development. It begins by displaying its amount of value in one other commodity and ends up by serving as material for the value expression of all other commodities. What holds for linen holds for every commodity. In its developed relative value expression, form 2, which only consists of its many simple value expressions, the linen does not yet figure as universal equivalent. Rather, every other commodity body forms, in this case, linen's equivalent, is thereby immediately exchangeable with it and is therefore able to change places with it. So the simple-minded way of looking at this is, you go into the store, I need a coat. I go to the coat section. I start looking for what's going to fit. And then I begin to examine the materials, some of which are wool or, linen or polyester or fur or fake fur. So you can see that there is something shared by all of these coat-like things. And linen appears perhaps in some of them. Other linen-like elements, the lining, etc., may appear in all of them. And that's another thing. So anyway, that's a very crude way of trying to empirically deal with it. But it does seem to me that you have to, imagine in your mind that there are, it's not like a Kantian category, but the categorization is going on in some kind of way. And the commodity form does have these things that occur, and these occur within the context of the market, and then there's the money form and blah, 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 blah. when we reversed the expanded form of value of the linen, this led to the general form of value with the linen now as general equivalent. However, it was by no means necessary to consider the expanded form of value of linen. It could have been any other commodity's expanded form of value. Marx finds a way to show how, in the linen's expanded form of value, every other commodity body could switch places with the linen. He begins to run through the possibilities resulting in form 4. So we finally obtain, this is the Marx text. So we obtain finally form 4, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or equals U amount of coffee, or V amount of tea, or X amount of iron, or Y amount of wheat, or etc. 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, or U times coffee, V times tea, or X times iron, or Y times wheat, etc. U coffee, that is U amount of coffee, U times coffee equals 20 yards of linen, or equals 1 coat, or V tea, or X iron, or Y wheat, or etc., V tea, etc. So the point here is that you have some transitivity going on here. I mean, that's kind of what's going on, is you seek something that obviously that is designed for another commodity form, which opens up for the realm of money, the commodity form called money. But each of these equations reflexively yields coat, coffee, tea, etc. as universal equivalent, consequently yields value expression in coat, coffee, tea, etc. as universal relative value form of all the other commodities. It is only in its opposition to other commodities that a commodity turns into the universal equivalent form. But every commodity turns into the universal equivalent form in its opposition to all other commodities. If every commodity confronts all other commodities with its own natural form as universal equivalent form, the result is that all commodities exclude themselves from the socially valid displaying of their amounts of value. So there's something going on here. It's something that is hidden or unavailable, and something that requires us to imagine all of the social value that's necessary. Let me break here and say, I can make that kind of generalization with all due respect. So I was watching this Scandinavian cooking show, and they were talking about coffee in Sweden. And then they did a segment where the coffee roasters in Stockholm had a place in South America, and I can't remember which country, and I apologize, but it's some country, and I can't remember whether it's Guatemala or El Salvador or Colombia or whatever, where the actual coffee beans came from. And then they discussed, kind of quasi fair trade arrangement with the whole harvesting of beans, et cetera, et cetera. But they were actually out there, in a very non-Swedish place, in the field with beans. Anyway, let me get back to Heinrich. Form 4 offers us numerous expanded forms of value, one for each commodity. Each of the expanded forms of value can be reversed so that one also obtains many general equivalents. However, that is by no means possible, since there can be only one general equivalent. What this form of value depicts on the level of form determinations is nothing other than what Marx shows in chapter 2 on the level of action to be the fundamental problem for commodity owners in the exchange process. For every commodity owner, the value of his commodity is expressed in the multitude of commodities that confront him. He therefore wishes to reverse his commodity's expanded form of value and use that commodity as the general equivalent. Yet, if every commodity owner does this, then no commodity is the general equivalent. So much for logic. This original version of the value form analysis thus includes a derivation of the specific form aspects of commodity owners' contradictory starting points. In that sense, the presentation is more comprehensive than the later one. By contrast, the money form is missing. In fact, the money form is somewhat misplaced in chapter 1, given that this chapter's level of abstraction is the analysis of form determinations. The transition from the general form of value to the money form is not a development based on the value form's properties, as in previous transitions, the result of social custom. That is a result of the activity of commodity owners. However, Marx only begins to treat the activity of commodity owners after the value form analysis, when on June 27, 1867, Marx sent Engels an overview of the simplified appendix's structure. He made an apologetic comment about including the money form as point 4. The following on the money form is simply for the sake of continuity, perhaps barely half a page. So, we have to intuit what Marx is going to do with this. So here, back to Marx. Obviously, the analysis of the commodity yields all essential determinations of the value form, and the value form itself in its contradictory vectors yields the universal relative value form, the universal equivalent form, and finally, the never-ending sequence of simple relative value expressions, which sequence forms at first a transitional phase in the development of the value form in order to finally suddenly shift into the specifically relative value form of the universal equivalent. But the analysis of the commodity yielded these forms as commodity forms in general, which thus also apply to each and every other commodity, in a contradictory manner. All coffee beans are the same, I guess. So that if commodity A finds itself to be in one of the contradictory form determinations, then commodities B, C, etc. adopt the other in opposition to it. What was decisively important, however, was to discover the inner necessary connection between value form, value substance, and value amount, i.e. expressed conceptually to prove that the value form arises out of the value concept. Now, that's really a long slog to get there, and coffee beans may not be the best example. I'm beginning to now think that chocolate, probably, and cocoa, those kinds of things. The nibs are the important problem. But anyway, the last sentence makes especially clear what Marx is dealing with in the analysis of the value form. That is the interrelation of form, substance, and magnitude of value. He's not presenting an abstract reconstruction of the historical development of the forms of value. Marx expresses conceptually the contemporary and simultaneous interrelation between value objectivity as captured in the concept of value and the value form. This conceptual form of expression is an example of how Marx coquetted with Hegel's terminology, as he mentions in the second edition's postface, page 103. The notion that a form arises from its concept stems from a way of thinking that held that quote-unquote spirit, which is reflected in concepts, is the actual reality, while the activity of the concept is the active dynamic element. Now, that may take a little while to sort of parse through, particularly if you've read a little Hegel and not enough Hegel or too much Hegel. But there is a difference among these things, and Hegelian scholars have tried to work through this as well, which is why raising the question of reading the logic as opposed to the phenomenology is important. Anyway, however, in the first edition of Capital, Marx not only coquetted with Hegel's mode of expression, he also criticized Hegel's autonomization of the concept. In this sense, it is telling what Marx says in relation to linen's value being expressed in a coat, with the result that the tailoring that produces the coat only counts as human labor as such. In effect, human labor as such can only exist as a specific type of labor that confronts external material. Marx throws in a criticism of Hegel here. It is only the concept in Hegel's sense that manages to objectify itself without external material, and quotes as proof the following sentence from Hegel's encyclopedia. This is the shorter version of, the combined version of all the Hegelian writings. It's not so much combined as it is synthesized. Anyway, the concept which is only subjective at first, marches ahead in accordance with its own proper activity to objectify itself without needing any external material or stuff for the purpose. Whoever has attentively read the value form analysis in the first edition's chapter 1 will not believe that what is conceptually expressed there amounts to a relapse into Hegelian conceptual speculation. In the second edition of Capital, Marx put the rational kernel of this conceptual form of expression into words. And that's the key element here, of course, because of the translation stuff. Our analysis has shown that the form of value, that is the expression of the value of a commodity, arises from the nature of commodity value. Now all that sounds very tautological and circular and blah, 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 but this is actually kind of important because you're trying to invoke the kind of sequence, which gets back to the sublation issue of why why Hegel's connected to this at all, on the one hand, but is entirely necessary because we've tried to make Hegel more material. That is, the value form does not arise from the concept of value, but rather from that which the concept of value expresses scientifically, namely, quote unquote, the nature of commodity value. Now, I know this is going to sound like gibberish, but it really does actually make a certain amount of sense. You just have to see it sort of in a relatively evolutionary or sequential order, and that these things kind of actually happen. I mean, they do happen not only within the context of trying to apply certain concepts to nature itself, but also to, the Anthropocene. That is, how is it that you get to a commodity? Commodities occur. I mean, they're part of an entire historical thing that occurs. And yes, they can occur simultaneous to other things that are still exchanged in a very primitive sort of way, with all the usual attachments. And the planet still kind of operates on this. It's uneven, and that's the whole kind of point. The utopian in one would say, like the shape of things to come, that and it's the question you get to at the end of shape of things to come, and that is stuff is happening, and a lot of this stuff doesn't happen. How does it happen? How is it assessed? Is it of infinite number so that all needs are met, etc., by because the airplane guys are in charge? Or are there a significant number of divisions that occur in the world? So anyway, that's my kind of take on that. I added videos that include Heinrich himself. It's a 2-hour yammer, and if you may get totally lost, but it only happened a year ago, so it does have kind of Heinrich's current position on all of these things. And yes, it has changed. It's not identical to his dissertation, which he did now over 20 years ago. So that's another issue that needs to be brought up. It's because his dissertation has never appeared in English until, now or the last couple of years. So that's a whole nother issue. And then, of course, there's the thing that precedes the 2021 commentary thing, which is the introduction to the 3 volumes of Capital. Whereas what I've just been reading from with the appendix is only about the first part. It's a commentary because he's trying to distinguish between describing, as Higginbottom tries to do, the whole thing, all 3 volumes, and simply focuses on some of the key issues that have still remained and why Marxists still fight about these things or have discourse about it, let's put it that way. And actually an important discourse, the 3 volumes of Capital. So there's that. This second video is just simply another guy having trouble pronouncing German. So that's a whole nother set of things. Now, the second thing, which I obviously don't seem to have time to read in its entirety, is on a different matter, but it's clearly related because, any good Marxian says, well, they're all related. But this is on the chapter that is misconceived in the Grundrisse, which does precede Capital, but it, was rediscovered, and a lot of people just hopped on the Grundrisse saying, well, that's more authentic because it happens earlier. And I'm oversimplifying here. And that's a little nuts too, because, Marx's concept evolves. I mean, he does, pick up things, modify things, drop things. So all that's in his history. And it's nothing, this is the problem of revisionism. You go back and, well, it must have been earlier, so it's more authentic or blah, blah, blah. People give up certain ideas, and it's not always linear, people don't necessarily think that way. So let me just read a couple of the first paragraphs so you get a flavor of the problem. And Heydrich doesn't call it that, but it is a kind of revisionism that is moving along in Marxist thought. And lest you think that's unimportant, there's a lot of work on this. There's a lot of it being still on Marx because, they're not contentious ideas so much as they're problems of translation. And if you look, for example, at the problem of translating Marx into Chinese, and then the whole question of Chinese scholarship of it, it's all driven by certain things. So, 40 years ago when this was still a super interesting topic to me, and then I came in contact with a guy who was at the Chinese Center. It's their advanced research thing for social science in the Chinese Academy. And we were having this conversation and he said, well, it's really, we just mainly look at French stuff. Thought to myself, Christ, you got, why aren't you looking at it simply in the German without the kind of Russian, And he said, no, it seems only acceptable to look at it in French stuff. So obviously it's different now, but it really is interesting to see, particularly in the literature. And then when you look at current Chinese stuff and when it comes back into English, what they're trying to deal with. And there's a lot of problems with that, with all due respect. I mean, it's just the big problem of advanced, it's techno-feudalism, actually. It's a kind of translation problems that you see in any academic enterprise. But anyway, that's another story. So let me read a couple of beginning paragraphs and then I'll stop. The Grundrisse belongs to the most beloved texts of Marxist interpreters. Some authors argue that the so-called Fragment on Machines is a central document for a Marxian theory of capitalist catastrophes, a kind of breakdown of capital, or at least a description of a process in which a new mode of production emerges, inaugurated by capitalism itself, but in contradiction with the logic of capital. So this is where techno-feudalism kind of lies. You sort of seize on this idea, and then you kind of, monkey around with it and you get to something, but it only resembles a fragment of what Marx is really talking about. So you kind of it's to publish new books, but I'm not sure that it ultimately answers some of the important questions. In such considerations, the results of the fragment are taken for granted. However, the results of this fragment on machines derive, on the one hand, from a one-sided conception of crisis in Marxist thinking since the early 1850s. There are a lot of revolutions going on. And on the other hand, from some shortcomings in the conception of basic categories in the Grundrisse. In the years after the Grundrisse, and remember, Grundrisse is foundation in German, so that's alone can have its own problems. Marx overcame both misconceptions. In Capital Volume 1, when dealing with the production of relative surplus value, we can find an explicit critique of the fragment on machines, ignoring Marx's theoretical development, as does Antonio Negri, rest in peace, when he states that the Grundrisse should be read for itself. One can easily neglect a discussion of this implicit self-critique of Marx. Reading the text for itself means accepting uncritically the results of the text. And it's a kind of retconning when you really think about it. In order to discuss the Grundrisse productively today, we have to contextualize the text, not only in the development of Marx's thought, we also have to situate our reading of the Grundrisse as Negri's, 1984 version. Anyway, in the development of the discussion about Marx in the 20th century, because this development has shaped many of the ways in which the Grundrisse was and still is read. The reception of the Grundrisse in the 20th century, when we discuss the work of a significant author, we always do so in a determinate historical situation, which provides us with specific problems and reservations. Certain things appear to us to be obvious, while others seem to be questionable or superannuated. Some of these evaluations would have appeared very differently 30 or 40 years earlier. In the case of Marx, furthermore, there is the fact that many texts that are today very important for the debate were not even published during his lifetime. This is the whole Engels business. His work has become accessible in its totality only slowly, right? The theories of surplus value, the Grundrisse, the economic and philosophic manuscripts, et cetera, not only the respective historical context, but also the respective state of publication of his text influenced the direction and course of many debates. Even in the case of Capital, Marx could only publish the first volume. Engels published the second and third volumes after Marx's death with considerable editorial interventions. Only in the last years have Marx's original manuscripts for these volumes been published in the context of the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, the MEGA, M-E-G-A. Yes, I know it's like MAGA, and that is kind of unfortunate, but weird. Thus, it is only now, after more than 100 years, that we can identify Engels' editorial interventions and discuss their conceptual and substantial relevance. That's kind of what Bellamy Foster has done in terms of the relation to Engels and other scientific stuff. At the beginning of the 20th century, after Karl Kautsky published the theories of surplus value between 1905 to 1910, it appeared as if all of Marx's critique of political economy was completely available, as the theories of surplus value were regarded as the fourth volume of Capital dealing with the history of the theory, which Marx had planned. In the reading that was then prominent, Marx was regarded as the great socialist economist who had demonstrated the exploitation of the working class, the crises-prone nature of capitalism, and the inevitable transition to socialism, first in the Communist Manifesto and later on a broader foundation in Capital. Most Marxists celebrated these findings as a triumph of scientific socialism. Beginning in the 1920s, however, there was a strengthening of the critique of actual or supposed tendencies in Marx's theory of economism, determinism, and above all, objectivism. In this context, the publication of Marx's early works, particularly the economic and philosophical, etc., this is a notation, were like a bombshell. Here, apparently, the broad philosophical and socio-theoretical background of Marxist economic analyses, the consideration of the human essence and alienation in capitalism became clear. The objectivism that has previously been so roundly criticized because of Stalin, along with the lack of a theory of the subject, could, so it seemed at least, be overcome on these foundations. This transformed perception was not a purely inner theoretical phenomenon, but the result of a determinate political reading, which in different ways was deployed against the tendencies toward petrification and dogmatism of official party Marxism. Fascism and Stalinism, however, made it impossible for the discussion that began in the early 1930s to develop in a significant sense. This occurred only in the 1960s, when the conditions of debate had substantially changed, because of the war, because of Khrushchev, blah, 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 blah. Above all, the reception of Marx's early writing had lost its almost automatically assured anti-dogmatic impulse. In the meantime, these texts had been integrated by the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy to a large extent. When, for example, Louis Althusser in 1965 criticized Marx's early writings as quote-unquote ideological and introduced the specific form of scientificity of Capital, this was also a critique of this orthodoxy. However, his strongly argued position also earned him the accusation, precisely from the anti-orthodox side, of having banished the subject and social struggles from the theoretical discussion. The debates over the relation between early philosophical and late economic theoretical Marx had multiplied, just as the political perspectives connected to the individual positions within these debates had. It was in this context that there really began for the first time a widespread reading of the Grundrisse, which enduringly influenced the terms and conditions of its interpretation. The Grundrisse, which was first published in 1939 to 41 in Moscow, was accorded only sporadic interest during the war and in the immediate post-war period. Even when the text was reprinted in the GDR, East Germany, in 1953, the text did not initially have many readers. This changed with the publication in 1968, note that year, of Roman Radolski's commentary on the Grundrisse. The Grundrisse was then discussed widely, not only in Germany, but with the French translation of 1967 and the first English translation of 1973. The debate began in many countries as well. The Grundrisse appeared to be the magic wand with which one could solve the problems in Marx's theory that had been discussed up until then. The contraposition of a young philosophical Marx and a mature economic theoretical Marx was seemingly lessened, but nevertheless found a mediating, connecting link in the Grundrisse. This text made it clear that the mature Marx's economic writings also were based upon a developed economic, philosophical foundation. What was lacking in Capital seemed to be present in the Grundrisse. While Marx dealt with the methodological questions in Capital almost only in the prefaces and afterwards, this problematic was raised continuously in the course of the presentation in the Grundrisse. There is also a much clearer reference to Hegel's philosophy in the Grundrisse, and this is why David Harvey has come back to that. Something similar is the case with which the question of subjectivity, much more strongly than in Capital, labor is conceptualized as the subjective counterpoint to Capital. Additionally, the 6-point plan that Marx envisaged as he wrote the Grundrisse, that is, capital, landed property, wage labor, state, international trade, world market, made clear that the intended object of investigation was much broader than that treated by Marx in Capital, because, that front-loading problem again. Finally, the Grundrisse seemed to be a supplement to Capital, since here a series of themes were discussed that received no corresponding treatment in the presentation of Capital. The most well-known of these themes occurs in the Grundrisse under the heading of forms that precede Capital's production, and in that fragment on machines that was discussed very early in an Italian workerism, the operation or whatever of the post-war period. The Grundrisse thus seemed to offer something for everybody. Today, the discussion of Marx is not conceivable without the Grundrisse. Indeed, the Grundrisse are a fascinating work, and reading them is a singular intellectual adventure. Anyway, so you can read this further on, and I have obviously run over my time and run over your attention. So I'm going to stop here and see whether there's any comments, interventions, brickbats, make economics great again. Make every town great again. Yes, Lenin and Lenin in one moment and abracadabra, money. Anyway, in this transformation, surplus, the transformation, yes, begins the process because it's a circuit. Surplus value builds as scale develops. You could argue this, that this transformational moment defined or described by a circuit eventually gets us to surplus value. But I think it's a question of scale, or at least that I would argue that that's kind of where Marx is headed because of his attention to problems in the average price and all that other jazz. The price and value problem becomes only more real with larger volumes. It's really in small numbers or in small scale, it's harder to identify. It becomes more identifiable as a macroeconomic issue. Doesn't mean to say it doesn't exist, because I think the impulse for surplus value is always there. But its realization, which is clearly a Marxian thing, only comes with a continued reproduction. So that would be the way to answer that particular argument. Okay, so are there interventions, brickbats,
I had a question.
denunciations? Yes.
You used the term objectivism just now in this context. I assume that is a different definition of objectivism from the Ayn Randian notion of objectivism, and if so, how?
One would assert that I think there's a resemblance because what um, Ayn Rand is responding to or reacting to is Stalinism. So
Mhm.
she's making
Oh,
an explicit connection to, advanced Stalinism. What she's
oh,
trying to
okay.
do,
So there is a connection. All right.
I do. She's not amplifying it so much as she's reacting to it or resisting it, right? That
Got
my
it.
understanding of Randianism is that it's essentially a way to reinforce a certain libertarian point of view about the subject or the individual, particularly under really existing socialism. So it's always a response, I think, to Stalinism. That would be
Ah,
my
okay.
position on it, and I think it follows through with a certain type of way in which you think about utopian ideas. Atlas Shrugged, for example, I think does have, it has a tech bro thing going on in it.
Oh, yeah.
And that's clearly a libertarian moment that tries to negate the human need for social interaction by forming the autonomous little thing that's out there in the valley or whatever the hell it is. Um,
Right. They're
uh,
hidden enclaves. Yes.
or similarly in the Fountainhead, the idea of trying to privilege the individual male will, you know,
Yes.
conquer
Over. Right.
conquer steel, conquer women, all the same thing. Um, so yes, and thank you for raising that because I do think that objectivism in that particular sense is pursued only in relation to a very specific brand of communism, whatever that is
Got it.
Stalinism. I would assert. Because
Yes.
I would think that it actually follows the same business of the 1956. You discover, Khrushchev does all these things, and a couple of people commit suicide, and it's just like, this is just horror. The Stalinist period was terrible, and blah 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 blah, and it's not where we are, and yet this same kind of question about objectives or whatever objectivism creeps out in certain Russian screeds by Putin, for example. He occasionally mentions objects, which is I always think whenever he says object that he's always trying to, he's kind of bring up Stalin again, but he never wants to say Stalin. It's kind of a thing.
Right. So in
Um,
that case, object meaning that which I desire to conquer.
yes,
Right.
it's a certain kind of will, and it's very
Yeah.
Russian in that sense. It goes back to what it is the victorious mining worker, who digs 21 tons in a day or whatever. These
Right.
heroic things are there, and in fact, you get that in the Fountainhead. That you have this kind of this really weird hyper real moment where what's her name Patricia Neal is attracted to Gary Cooper in a
Oh,
really bizarrely stereotypic thing.
when he sees
Central
him,
casting,
yes. Right. As he's digging whatever mine, whatever yeah, he's uh, granite, whatever they have there. Yeah,
yeah,
the
he's in the
granite
quarry. He's in the
quarry. He's
digging,
quarrying. There's the word.
digging stuff.
Sweaty and
And the
muscular and
drill
all
is
of that. Oh, the
penetrating the
drill is
stone,
penetrating it.
and you have the swirling music, and it's just
Yeah.
there's and the fact is, Patricia
Oh,
Neal was having an affair with Gary Cooper, during
oh, I
this
didn't.
thing. So
Oh,
so
there's
it's
a
got
bit of.
all that shit going
Oh, I
on.
didn't know that part.
Yes. So
No, I just know the
that's
very
kind of
erotic, the visceral description in the book with the sweat dripping down his. It's like, oh, come on.
well in the movie. You just got,
Yeah,
oh well,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
okay. All right. Well, let me stop on that that moment and get us off the God.
Well, thank you for
Uh,
that.
all right, and we will